of a neighboring country in our country. And that conditioning started, and it's rebound on us, it's rebound on everybody. And today, if we make a serious effort, I've tried my best. I've been teaching for 30 years. I did it as a professional obligation. I brought out a book. And I've tried to tell the whole truth. If I say that my book is error-free, I'll be indicted for blasphemy. But I've made every human effort. You see, one thing you must understand, I was taught by Urdu teachers, Hindu teachers in East Pakistan, and I can confirm what Dr. Husboy is saying, that none of my Hindu teachers preached secession in any way whatsoever. The more chauvinistic were the Muslim teachers. But then their interaction with the students was also very, very positive. My teachers in Dhaka University, Dr. Fatima Hassan Sant, she taught me the history of South Asia, Dr. Sufia Ahmed, and well, I think that she imbued in all her students, not only me, all her students, how to write history without bias. We were conditioned to it. We can't tolerate everything. About East Pakistan, there are two things that you must remember. Number one, people forget that the elections were held to a Constituent Assembly on the 2nd of May 1970, I think it was, at Hatia, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman himself said that the coming elections was the framing of a constitution, not for the transfer of power. And it was a constitutional crisis because Bhutto is a particular bête noire of our historians. So that aspect of it is sort of a hidden to put obloquy on him. But yes, that is one mental block in our understanding of our own history, and it should be resolved. Dr. Hamida Kuro, she used to teach in the Department of History when I was a student, and she resigned over the atrocities committed against the East Bengalis. So it's not absolutely a mindset which has everybody in its grip. Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to bring in Hamida Kuro, who I know has a strong interest in school textbooks. And in the interests of non-biased history, I'm going to point out now that Pakistan is not the only country with a problem with biased textbooks. Last year, the Texas School Board voted to replace the word slave trade in its textbooks with Atlantic triangular trade. American imperialism is removed from textbooks and replaced with expansionism. Capitalism is removed and replaced with the words free enterprise. So this is not a problem confined to this country. Dr. Kuro, I know that you're working on books for children about the history of Sindh. Yes. How do we go about addressing this problem at an early stage?
I haven't worked that out myself as yet. But I must say it must be taken as axiomatic that there can be no history without bias. Because with best intention of in the world, a historian is a person brought up in a certain culture with certain beliefs, and so on. And those do creep in. I have written, apart from the children's book, I wrote a biography of my father, which of course everyone assumed daughters his version. I went to great pains to verify everything twice and thrice, you know. But even then, I would say that people who read it would say, okay, this is the daughter writing, you know. So that is difficult. The other thing is that any history is written, as was mentioned about the wars between France and Germany and from various others, any history written by after a war, let's say, or anything, is always written from the point of view of the victors. So there's no question, the defeated are always marginalized. So you don't get the whole picture, anything. Perhaps the earliest text, earliest narrative in the history, or ancient history, belongs to the subcontinent, the Mahabharata. Now, Mahabharata was in, I suppose you could call it a epic poem or something, but that again is extremely biased in favor of the victors. Even at that time, in 1500 BC or whatever, it was still very much a victor story, and even the god Krishna is, is taking sides in this thing. So if you get this tendency from 1500 BC, there's very little chance that you arrive at a neutral sort of sense now. And for children, really, I've tried extremely hard to be as neutral as possible. But the other thing is that there's the difficulty for the modern historian who relying on documents to be able to read those documents. You have to be able to read the documents because you have to go into the motives of the writers. You have to, and for this, the latest theories of deconstruction really, go into, you have to go into the layers of writing. You have to examine the motives, each statement, where does it come from, what is behind the statement, and so on. So it is that if you're going to write a history with that kind of, objectivity in mind, I don't know if you can produce a volume even in a lifetime, but that's what the latest demand is. The other thing from this point of view of the subcontinent writers, of course, we have a huge, huge wealth of historical writing. Not only do we have the ancient texts, we have the first written history of the subcontinent was from Sindh. And okay, so quite a lot of it is romantic fiction and so on. But this is the book, the Fateh-Name Sindh, written after the Muslim conquest. And in that, for the first time, you get actual documents, historical documents are given in that history. And so that, you know exactly, I mean, there can be no doubt that this was written by the Hajjaj bin Yusuf from Iraq to Muhammad bin Qasim. These are his instructions. They're given in detail, as and when the documents are given. So we have got a very, not only wealth of histories, but also some really good principles in those. There is, for instance, the medieval history that has been written here. You know, the Mughals used to have historians writing their accounts every day in their courts. But they also had newsletters from each district, each taluka of the whole empire, coming in to bring all this information into the center. And so if the historians of that period have had all this material, we know about Abul Fazal and so on, but actually there is, even if one knew that now, if you know Persian, if you know those things, you could still go into this and produce social and cultural histories for which there's immense material, but which nobody has written. Unfortunately, the emphasis has always been on political history, and that always, of course, seems to be biased. But if there is material for cultural histories and social histories in this country which could be written, the great turning point in the history of the colonized world really came with Edward Said's Orientalism. Now that, I think, you cannot write history of this part of the world without taking that into consideration. He showed that the West had, the colonizing West had objectified the East. You know, all those romantic paintings of slave girls and harems and so on. And also, but had the real intention perhaps was to show that these were really primitive, innocent peoples who needed to be, civilized. The great example of this, I think, would be Robert Louis Stevenson's Man Friday, in Treasure Island, the innocent native who is taught by the white man. So I would say the most influential and the most comprehensible also, and he was not even a historian, he was a professor of literature. Edward Said is perhaps the most influential, in my view, man, at least for people who are writing about history of the third world or colonized world or whatever.
I'd like to pick up on that point about Edward Said, an absolutely crucial writer when you're writing about this part of the world from the West, particularly. You can't not read Edward Said. But we're still in a situation where a lot of the kind of at the front of the bookshops, a lot of the big selling books on South Asia are being written still by Westerners. I mean, I'm kind of guilty myself of that, and people like William Dalrymple, Patrick French, Martin Gilbert, Stanley Wolpert. Why is so much of South Asian history still being colonized by white folk like me? I'm going to put this horrible question to Jean-Luc Racine and make him responsible for it.
I don't believe that I'm really responsible for that, for the good reason that I'm not an historian myself, so it's easy to escape from the blame. But I would like to, amongst many other issues which could be addressed, take a leaf from what Dr. Hamida Kourou said about colonial or post-colonial history. Again, with the French experience. A few years ago, in the French Parliament, a section of the MPs tried to have a law passed stating that despite, of course, what criticism we can have about French colonization, particularly in Algeria, everything was not black with colonization. And so there was a great debate about that. It was saying, well, colonization has to be totally pushed aside and rightly criticized. It's a part of the necessary post-colonial rethinking about what the past was. And it ran up for a few weeks or months till the day when the French president, Jacques Chirac, decided that, there would be no law about that, because it's clearly not to the legislators to write history and to decide, to pass judgment of what history was. And of course, and here I'm far away from the point I touched before about Franco-German relationship. Here we deal with our own French national history, with its black spot, how colonialism was carried on. There is also a big issue about, for instance, the slave trade. Who was responsible for the slave trade? And obviously it's easy to show how the French companies in the 18th century prospered by trading slaves from Africa to West Indies. But at the time, there was also a French historian, a very serious academic French historian, who underlined that, of course, whatever have been the responsibility of the European trading companies in slave trade, there were also in West Africa Arab slave traders and local kings, African kings, who indulged themselves in the slave trade. It was enough to publish a book like that in a prestigious publisher. It was not at all a kind of polemics. It was serious history. And there was a movement against this historian by a number of associations from French national, but immigrated either from West Indies or from Africa, saying that it's absolutely a shame. The real responsible for the slave trade were not the Arabs or not the black kings. It was basically the European trade companies, because of course the European trade companies were the most important actor of the slave trade. But this is just to say that, of course, a couple of centuries after that occurred, it's still a matter of debate. And even today, and it would be my last point as well, there is a debate in the country about the need or not to have a museum on French history. This is a proposal which has been set up by the present president, and immediately the corporation of historians divided itself. Those being ready to play the game to add an additional museum in Paris, and those saying, no way, we shall not participate in a state decision to build up a new museum on national history because we don't want to officialize in any way what history is supposed to be. So let's history to be the preserve of historian, but not just of historian, because by definition history is a matter of debate. And I think it's extremely significant to the point where we are now. Probably a few decades ago, there would have been a kind of consensus for saying, yes, we need a kind of new museum about the national history. Now it's not something which can be easily decided, precisely because now everyone understands that there is no history without bias.
Pervez Hoodbhoy, I'd like to pick up on a point that Jean-Luc Racine just made, because we're talking there about different French versions of a history of the slave trade, but it's one thing for the French to fight themselves about it, but is it meaningful until we have, say, a Congolese history of the slave trade, a Senegalese history, a Ghanaian history of the slave trade? Do we actually need to redress history by having people in post-colonial history, people in the countries affected by this writing history?
Well, there's a fascinating book called The Writing of History by E.H. Carr. I read it a long time ago, but he asked the question whether in fact you can write history objectively in that manner.